2010?
912 Saddle Creek Lane.
Get
912.
a little closer to that microphone, if you would, please. I think it'll move. Bring it up to you, please. Thank you.
912 Saddle Creek Run.
And that was right next door to Brandy Peters' residence?
Correct.
Okay. I want to direct your attention to the late night hours of December 19th, 2010. What time did you get home that night?
A little after, closer to like 11 o'clock.
Okay. And when you got home, did you notice any vehicles in Miss Peters' driveway?
Off my recollection, there was like a white SUV in the driveway.
Okay. And you believe you got home about 11 o'clock, you said?
Mm-hmm.
All right. At some point after you got home, did you have a dog at the time?
Yes, we had two.
Okay. At some point after you got home, did you let your dogs out into your backyard?
Actually, we had a dog that stayed inside of the house, and we also had a larger dog that we kept outside at all times.
Okay. Did the dog who was outside at some point start barking vigorously that evening?
Yes.
Which direction was the dog facing when he was barking like that?
Brandy's home.
Okay, so if you're looking into your backyard, Brandy's house would have been on your left side, right?
Correct.
Okay. And Zeus, that was the dog's name?
Yes.
He's outside facing Brandy's house, running the fence line right there?
He was pacing back and forth, correct.
Okay. Now, the wood line, that's back behind your house, correct?
Correct.
And he wasn't facing the woods, he was facing Brandy's house?
No, he was. It was in the wee hours of the morning. I was actually on my cell phone talking to a friend of mine, and he just wouldn't stop barking. So I actually told her to hold on a second, let me see why he was barking, because we had motion lights on our home, so if anyone walked past, the floodlights would automatically do what they're supposed to. The lights on that side of the house were on, so the way our fence is, when we open up our French doors, we have a gazebo. So I walked out into the gazebo and was like, Zeus, be quiet. You know, because the neighbors tend to, if he barked a lot, they would call and complain about the dog barking. So.
And so you said the motion lights on that side of the house facing Brandy's house had come on, correct?
Correct.
No further questions for the witness at this time.
Cross.
Make sure I understand correctly. You would have been, if you're facing Brandy's house, you're on the right-hand side?
No,
You're on the left-hand side?
I'm to the left.
Okay. And then your fence encompasses your backyard?
My fence borders her house.
Okay, and I'm assuming it's the three different sides, it's three sides and connects to the house and fence it in, right?
Right, her house was not fenced in. So if she wanted to fence in her home, she would have to attach her fence to our fence.
Okay, all right. There is no door to Brandy's house on that side of your house, correct?
No, just her bathroom window from the secondary bathroom, and that's the only other window when you go back to the back of the house. All the houses in the neighborhood are built by the same builder, so pretty much everybody's house looks the same, just about on the inside, minus the fixtures.
I'm confused. You said that the bathroom window is on the same side as your house?
Yes. So when you walk into my home, you walk into an open living room.
Okay.
When you walk towards my kitchen, there's French doors. So when I go out my French doors onto the back slab, if I look to my left, I will be looking at Brandy's house. So when you look at Brandy's house from my side of the fence, you can see like a small bathroom window. That's the only window that's on that complete side of the house.
Okay. That's the only window on that side of the house?
That I can remember, yes.
Okay. And you said when you're looking at Brandy's house, you are to the left side of it.
Facing into my home, I am the exact house right next door to her house, yes.
But again, you're looking at Brandy's house, you are to her left.
I am to her left.
Showing you what was previously marked as State Exhibit 5A. And looking at this, this would be Brandy Peters' house. Is this your home right here?
No. When I walk in my house facing, Brandy's house is on the left-hand side of me. My home would be on
So
that side.
you're on the other side? Okay.
Yes, that's why I
All
said
right, that's
facing
fine.
into my home.
Okay.
That's why I
So
made
again,
that distinction.
if you're looking at Brandy Peters' home, as we are in this photograph, you're going to be on this side, right?
Correct.
Okay. And the only window you remember on that is the window to the bathroom, the small window?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That is correct.
Okay.
I'm sorry. That is correct.
Okay. I noticed you used, whenever you were talking about how to spell your name, you used Tango and other military types.
Alphanumeric, yes.
Are you former military?
No,
Okay.
not at all.
All right, just out of curious. Whenever you're out there listening to your dog bark during that time period, did you hear any gunshots?
Not that I can recall.
No gunshots? Certainly would have been something you told law enforcement if you had, right?
I would have.
Okay. No further questions?
Redirect.
Just one real quick question. I've been told that I mistakenly said December 19th when I was asking you about these events.
November.
November 19th, correct?
It's November.
Thank you. No further questions for the witness.
Is your have a question of this witness? We'll go sidebar. Just one follow-up question from the jury. Ms. Scott, how often does Zeus bark at night?
Only when there's a commotion.
What's that?
Only when there's a commotion.
You had said something about the neighbors that were quick to complain or
Yes,
something
if he
along
barked
that line.
profusely.
Has that happened before?
No. The house next door on the other side on the other side of Brandy's house were rented by,
Talk to them.
I'm sorry, the
I know
house
I'm
next door, the one that was actually in the picture, that was actually rented by a grad student. So like whenever they would have like get-togethers, I know they had a going-away party, the dog would bark when there's a lot of, like I said, a lot of commotion. Besides that, he slept right by the French doors to our home. So whenever he barked, I knew either someone was walking by or something was going on. Hence why I got up to go outside and look.
Mr. Prince,
No further questions, John.
Mr. Fuchs.
But it sounds like it's been called on a number of occasions before, because you said the neighbors have called.
Well, there's more than one dog in the neighborhood. So just from talking to other neighbors, neighbors talk, they'll, say, so-and-so called about dogs barking. So it wasn't just my house on that block that had a dog. The neighbor across the street, directly in front of my home, he also had a dog. 3 houses down from my home also had a dog.
And none of those dogs were barking on this night, just your one, right?
I wasn't paying attention, to be honest.
Okay, well, you walked outside, you looked at your dog, you looked at your lights, but you didn't pay attention. Were there other dogs go barking in the neighborhood?
I don't recall.
All right.
Nothing further.
Nothing else.
Ready to keep this witness any further?
No, Your Honor, she can be released.
All right, you're excused. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Call your next witness.
At this time, Your Honor, the defense would rest.
Good. Do you need a moment, Mr. Fuchs, or you ready to proceed?
All my witnesses are present.
All right. At this stage would be what we call as rebuttal. Rebuttal is limited to responding to something that's been raised in the defense case. State indicates they have, I guess, about 5 rebuttal witnesses. Up here, please, ma'am. And you remain under oath?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Start by stating your name for the record, please.
My name is Sergeant April DeBrava Wilder. Last name is spelled DOUBRAVA-Wilder, WILDER.
Officer Wilder, or Sergeant Wilder, excuse me. You were involved in, obviously we've already heard, you were involved in the homicide investigation regarding Brandy Peters.
Yes.
I know that we went over a lot of your involvement having to do with the crime scene. We'll get to that in just a minute. But were you also involved and all the conversations and other evidence gathering in the actual investigation, team meetings and things like that.
Yes.
I'm showing you what's been previously marked for identification purposes as statement exhibit number 145. Actually, take a look at that. You recognize that?
Yes.
What is that?
That's Malika Segura's vehicle.
Okay. Yeah, is that an accurate depiction of her vehicle?
Yes, because hers has the gold trim on the bottom.
Okay. And Your Honor, may, this time I move state's exhibit number 145 to evidence.
Any objection?
No, Your Honor.
Be admitted.
Still interested in public jury, Your Honor?
You may.
Large white SUV,
Yes.
Ford Expedition, I believe it is, correct?
Right, Ford Expedition, yeah.
Did Mrs. Segura's mother have a similar vehicle?
Mr. Segura's, mother has I think a Ford Expedition also, white.
I couldn't quite understand you.
Yes, she also has a large SUV. I think it's an Expedition. It's white also.
Okay. During the course of your investigation, while we already talked about you being on crime scene and all the things that went through the processing of the crime scene, you were present, correct?
Correct.
At any point during the processing of that crime scene, was a wrapper to a condom found?
No, not to my knowledge.
Would that be something that would stand out in your mind as an investigator if one of those had been found?
Yes.
Why is that?
Would have been evidence that she just had sexual activity recently, depending, obviously if it's on top of the trash, recent.
And nothing like that was found?
No.
No further questions.
You talked about a couple of the different white SUVs involved in this vehicle, involved in this case. Brandy's mother also had a white SUV, right?
That I don't know. I didn't interact with her family, so I can't answer that for you.
Okay, so fair to say a number of people involved in the case on both sides had white SUVs?
I can only tell you the two that I know.
Okay. Were you present during the processing of Brandy's bedroom?
Yes. The first day, the initial day, yes.
And did you personally collect all of the items that were present?
I was there when it was collected. I don't personally collect it myself.
Okay. Did they pick through the trash cans in every area of the house?
We looked through the trash cans, yes.
You looked through them, or you took it out, emptied it, and picked through it?
We looked through them. The rest of that would have been the second and third day.
Okay.
But
And you weren't present when that happened?
no, I was not present the second and third day.
No further questions. Good luck.
Redirect.
Despite that, if the condom had been found, would you have been notified?
Yes.
Nothing was found.
No.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Any juror have a question of this witness on this subject? All right, you can step down. We need to keep her further.
No, Your Honor.
You're excused. Call your next witness.
Okay, we'll call investigator Mark Lewis.
You remain under oath.
Yes, Your
Investigator Lewis.
Morning, investigator.
Good morning.
You testified on Friday and were asked some questions regarding Jack McLean Park and a potential blood stain on a sink there.
Yes, that's correct.
Following that testimony, did you have an occasion to go back and look at the crime scene photos from the photos from Jack McLean Park that were taken and take a look further at that sink?
Yes, I did.
Did you go out, did you look at photographs that were from a long range? I believe there's two sinks, so you could tell whether you were looking at the right or the left sink?
Yes.
Okay. And then did you look closer in so you could actually see what stain we're talking about, or what stain was being talked about?
Yes, I
Is that the sink that is on the right-hand side at Jack McLean Park?
did. Yes, it is.
And the fence exhibit 9EE, is that the same?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Following that testimony over the weekend, did you have an occasion to go, and I believe your testimony back then was that you weren't sure whether or not it was in fact blood or not, correct?
That is correct.
Over the weekend, did you have an occasion to go back to look at Jack McLean Park?
I did.
And did you look at those particular things?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Showing you what's been previously marked for identification purposes, 146A and B. As you take a look at these photographs. You recognize those?
Yes, I do.
What are those photographs?
These are the pictures.
Don't show them to the jury yet.
I'm sorry. These are the pictures of the bathroom that I took.
Okay, and that was over the weekend?
Yes, Friday.
Specifically, did you go and look at closer up as to a, what appeared to be a stain in the same location as the crime scene photos?
Yes, I did.
Photos?
Yes, I did.
And you take a picture of that as well?
I did.
Are those an accurate depiction of those photographs that you took?
Yes, it is.
And the stain as it looked over the weekend?
Yes, it is.
Okay, Your Honor, this time I'm going to state exhibit number 146A and B in evidence, please.
Any objection? Be admitted.
Photograph A, these are the two things you're talking about?
Yes.
Did you look at the one on the right?
Yes, I did.
Specifically, the stain we're talking about, was it on the left-hand side of the one on the right?
Yes, it is.
B, is that stain?
Yes, it is.
Appear to be the same one?
They appear to be.
Obviously, 6 years later, that's not a blood stain, is it?
That is not a blood stain.
Looking over the weekend, what was it?
It's a crack in the porcelain. It's got some rust in it.
What was it?
Cross.
Obviously, it was suspected back in 2011 when that scene was processed that it could be blood. Otherwise, they wouldn't have photographed it, right?
Yes.
Okay, and yet it wasn't swabbed or tested or anything along those lines.
I don't know if it was or was not, sir.
Now, when you went back this weekend, did you find any bloody clothes, latex gloves, bleach bottles, burnt trash cans, anything like that?
No, I didn't.
No further questions.
Redirect.
As it relates to the bleach bottles that was just asked about, did you have any experience or knowledge as it relates to those? Did they mean anything to you?
Yes.
What is that?
It appears to be the cleaner that the city uses to clean those bathrooms.
You're talking about the ones that you found years ago?
Yes.
Okay. Again, you testified previously that they cleaned them on a daily basis through your experience?
Yes.
I don't know really when they emptied the trash can, but that cleaner was consistent with what they utilized?
For the city of Tallahassee, yes.
As your experience also in observing those cleaning crews, do they also wear those latex gloves for cleaning purposes?
I know they wear latex gloves to clean the bathrooms.
Any juror have a question of this witness? All right, no, you may step down. Call your next one.
State calls Monica Peters.
You remain under oath, Ms. Peters.
Yes, sir.
You can have a seat. Slide up the microphone, please.
Good morning, Ms. Peters. Thanks for joining us again. You told us last week, the last time you spoke to your sister, Brandy Peters, was in the late afternoon of November 19th, and that you tried to call her again later in the evening, but it went straight to voicemail. Was it her cell phone that you were trying to call her on?
Yes.
And her cell phone number, is that 590-8171?
Yes.
Okay, that's what you remember her cell
Yes,
phone to
that's
be?
what I remember.
All right, I want to show you what's been marked and shown to defense counsel as states 144. Do you recognize states 144, Ms. Peters?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Do you recognize that to be the sworn statement that you wrote for police on November 20th of
Yes.
2010?
Yes, ma'am, I do.
Okay, and does it appear to be a true and accurate copy of the sworn statement that you wrote, except for the parts that have been redacted?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, at this time, I would move 144 into evidence.
Any objection?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Let's go sidebar, please. Proceed.
Yes, sir. Ms. Peters, looking at that sworn statement in front of you, can you read to us what you wrote in that sworn statement that day, right after you put your personal information at the top?
Friday, 11/19/2010 was the last time I talked to Brandy. Then it goes down to say my mom called me to see if I had talked to her. It was about 9 or 10 o'clock. So this morning, which would have been in Saturday morning, which was 10:20, I called, but she still didn't answer the phone. It was going to voicemail.
Okay, and the date you put before this morning was 11/20/10?
Yes.
All right, so in that sworn statement, are you saying that you talked to your sister at 10 or 9 p.m., or that your mom called you to see if you had talked to your sister at 10 or 9 p.m.?
My mom called me.
Okay. But that the last time you talked to her was on 11/19, was
Yes.
on November 19th. Okay. And you told us today that the last time you spoke to her was late afternoon?
Late afternoon.
All right. Did you also give an interview to police a few days later?
Yes, I did.
All right. And have you had an opportunity to look at the transcript of your interview this morning?
Yes, earlier.
In that interview, did you also tell police that your mom called you about 10 o'clock to see if you had talked to Brandy?
Yes.
And did you also tell them that once you called her at that point, it went to voicemail?
Yes.
Okay. That's all. Thank you.
Cross.
In your testimony, you don't have any recollection of telling the first officer you spoke to, Officer Jernigan, specifically that you had spoken, not attempted to talk to, not attempted to call. You don't recall telling Officer Jernigan that you had actually spoken to Brandy at approximately 10 p.m.?
No, not in my recollection.
Okay.
I don't remember.
No further questions.
Think further, Ms. Dugan. Hold it, wait.
When you talked to police the morning of November 20th outside your sister's house, were you pretty upset that morning?
Yes, I was very emotional because I was the first person there after the phone call.
Okay. Were you crying?
Yes.
All right. When you look at that sworn statement, is it pretty messy? And
It was all messy because my emotion was flying everywhere at that moment.
all right. Thank you.
All right, you can step down. Call your next witness.
Yes, Your Honor. David Paul Davis.
Give that back to Ms. Dugan. Come up here, please. You face the clerk and be sworn, please.
Yes, they do.
Have a seat inside that microphone, please, sir.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the jurors?
My name is Jason Bundy.
Hey, Mr. Bundy, where do you work?
I work for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement in the biology section.
Okay. And what is it
Get
that you,
just a little closer to that microphone, if you would,
Sure.
please, Mr. Bundy. Thank you.
what do you do with the biology section?
I'm both a crime laboratory analyst as well as the biology technical leader.
Okay, what does that mean, technical leader?
A technical leader is a person that's designated to work on procedures, help people finish training, and go through quality issues.
Okay. Are you assigned to the Florida Department of Law Enforcement here or another location in Florida?
I'm located in Tampa.
Okay. Did you at some point become involved in a homicide investigation regarding the deaths of Brandy Peters and her children?
Yes, I did.
Okay. During the course of that, let me ask you a question. In order to do this DNA analysis or your role there, have you had any kind of specialized training experience?
Yes, extensive training.
Can you please explain that to the jury?
Sure. I have a master's degree in biochemistry and molecular biology, and once I was employed at the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, I applied that specifically through a training program for DNA and forensics.
Okay. And how long have you been working with the Florida Department of Law Enforcement?
About 13 years.
During the course of your employment at the Department of Law Enforcement, have you gone back and done regular training, say on top of the field and everything like that?
Well, we have both continuing education as well as when technology changes, we're trained in the changes as well.
Have you previously testified as in a courtroom in the state of Florida as it relates to DNA comparison analysis?
Yes, I have.
Approximately how many times?
Approximately 30 times.
Your Honor, this time I attend to the witness.
Any more there?
No, sir.
You may proceed.
Now, we talked about you got involved in the homicide investigation regarding Ms. Peters and her children.
Yes, I was.
Back in 2016, were you asked to analyze a DNA sample from a DeMario Paramore?
Yes, I was.
Okay, and how is it you go about examining that DNA sample from Mr. Paramore?
The sample was a cheek swab, commonly referred to as a buccal swab, so I did STR DNA analysis, which is our standard DNA testing, to create a DNA profile.
Okay. And prior to doing so, had you also had an opportunity to go back and look at Mrs. Joellen Brown's testing that was done?
Yes, I was.
When you look at her testing, did you look at strictly her results, or did you go back and look at the electropherograms and all those kind of things?
I looked at all of the data.
Okay. And when you went and compared and took a look at Mr. Paramore's, did you go back and compare it to that data?
I compared it to all of the data that was interpretable, yes.
Okay, what does that mean?
Sometimes when you have DNA data, for various reasons, whether there's not enough of it or there's too many people in the results of the DNA test, some of it is not interpretable just due to the inability to either separate or have a clearly defined profile.
Okay. And we're talking about like star alleles, I think we've heard them referred to previously. Is that what we're talking about, where the RFUs are too low?
Yes, that's one of the reasons, yes.
Okay. As it relates to Mr. Paramore, it's my understanding you made a comparison as to a specific item, item 203, which was a cigarette found in an ashtray in the master bedroom. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
What were your findings as it relates to that location?
That exhibit was excluded as being a contributor to the mixture.
Okay, so as I understand that correctly then, Mr. Paramore was excluded as being in the mixture there.
Correct. He was not in the DNA on that item.
Okay, as it relates to any other items for Mr. Paramore, did you go back and look at for inclusion or exclusion?
I did not do any other items specifically. No, everything else was not interpretable or known to be from a family member.
Okay, so it already previously been identified at that point, or it was non-interpretable?
Correct.
Okay. No further questions.
Ross?
Mr. Bundy, there's a lot of room for analyst discretion when interpreting, correct?
We have very specific procedures, but there still is room for variation, yes.
And one of the things you already talked about, star alleles, as one example, is something that might make a sample uninterpretable. Another is if you think there are multiple donors present in a mixture versus somebody else thinking there are, an identifiable amount of donors. Is that true?
Yes. Some of the variation in that interpretation would be whether you can expect a donor to be in a mixture. So frequently in a case like this where it's a home and there are multiple people living in the home, it could vary depending on the item of who you can and cannot assume would be on that mixture.
And we don't have to go through individual exhibits, but suffice it to say that you disagreed with Joellen Brown's interpretations. You didn't actually do comparisons like she did on many of the evidentiary exhibits because you thought that they weren't interpretable.
That is correct.
Okay. Let me ask you specifically about FDLE Exhibit 33, PPD 24, the swab of the phone cradle.
I'm going to object this outside the scope of direct examination.
Overruled.
You analyzed that, correct?
I reviewed the data, if that's what you're referring to.
Yeah, I should be more specific. You reviewed the electropherograms and did your own interpretation, correct?
Yes, I did.
And you determined that there was at least 2 parties present, correct?
Can I refer to my notes?
Sure.
You said it was Exhibit 33?
Yeah.
What was the item number?
The agency item number is 24, FDLE
It's the
33.
swab of the phone cradle that's State Exhibit 35, TPD 33, FTLE 24.
I'm
Is
sorry.
that what we're talking about?
Yes, sir. I'm sorry. I had the TPD and FTLE numbers transposed.
It says at least 2 individuals, yes.
Okay. And because you didn't want to make assumptions about who some of those donors could be, and because of the presence of dropout and start allele, you decided not to interpret that, correct? Or deemed it uninterpretable, I guess is the right way to say it.
Correct, based on the low amount of information, other than what was compared,
And
yes.
so you wouldn't have actually done comparison between that item and other known standards in this case, correct?
That is correct. Once it's deemed not interpretable, I wouldn't then go back and look at it again with a known standard, because the expectation is that whenever there is questioned evidence, you have to determine the nature of its interpretability or not. If it's not interpretable, it means it can never be compared to any of the reference standards. That's what not interpretable is meant to mean. So you can't call it not interpretable and then get a reference and then make a comparison. You determined up front it was not interpretable.
And so as you look at the item and you determine that it's not interpretable, I just want to make sure I understand that part of the basis for that finding, that it's not interpretable, is because of the presence of multiple donors, correct?
Or the low-level nature can be not interpretable if it could be consistent with a single individual. If it's really, really low, it's still to the point where it's not interpretable just because you cannot be confident of the information that's there.
With respect to this particular sample, though, not talking about in general, with respect to this in particular sample, one of the reasons you deemed it interpretable was because of the presence of multiple donors, right?
It was at least 2, which means there's certainly 2, potentially more. And there was also a major contributor, meaning someone who gave a large amount of the DNA. And once you have a major contributor and there's other information that's a lot lower, they tend to potentially share or mask each other. And so it becomes very difficult to make any additional interpretations at that point.
One thing within the operating procedures that analysts are allowed to do is attempt to make logical inferences about whose DNA they might expect to be on a particular item. That's not improper, correct?
No, there are allowances for that, of course.
And analysts can disagree about when it's appropriate to do that or not, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And you didn't find any of the assumptions that Joel and Brown drew unreasonable. You just disagreed, correct?
Correct.
Okay. No further questions.
Redirect? They are. All right, any juror have a question of this witness? All right, if not, you can step down. Who's your next witness, Mr. Steve?
Dr. Kevin McFarland.
Why don't we go ahead and take a break? We've been quite an hour, but I know it'll probably be a little while. We'll take 10 minutes, let you step out. Either side need anything?
No, sir.
All right, we'll be in recess.
Cars, you've used that math to formulate how often or how rare you might see something in the population. And then the molecular part of it is, well, why is it that something rare? In the case of the Rolls Royce, it has to do with how much money it costs. But all of those things fit together, and I study how all of those work together, and then in my particular case, how they work together in forensic analysis and things like DNA mixtures and related topics.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, you deal with the analysis of DNA type aspects and then how that relates into the general population.
That's correct.
Okay, I know I summarized it there, but I assume that you obviously have to have some sort of education and experience in order to do that.
Yes, sir, I do.
Can you please explain that to the jury?
Okay, I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in Biological Sciences from Florida International University in Miami, Florida. I have a Master's of Science degree in Molecular, Cellular, and Developmental Biology from Iowa State University of Science and Technology. And I have a PhD in Molecular and Population Genetics from the University of Georgia. I did postdoctoral research both at the University of Georgia on molecular aspects of DNA sequence differences, and then I did subsequent postdoctoral research at the United States Department of Agriculture in Gainesville, Florida.
Okay. And how long have you been with the Florida International University?
The last 3 years I've been at Florida International. Prior to that, I was with a company called the Bodie Technology Group, which did forensic DNA analysis. And in fact, we developed, using some government contract and research grants, some of the current technology that's used in forensics today, particularly the STR programs that are used.
Could you give us the name of that company again, please, sir?
The Bodie Technology Group.
Spell that for us.
BODE.
Okay, thank you.
And that was a group that formed out of a Department of Defense related research group that I was a member of after I had done postdoctoral research. I went to a company in New York called Life Codes that actually was developing the first forensic DNA tests done in the US, and I helped build the very first DNA databases used for figuring out how often we saw the blue Ford, if you will. And it was from Life Codes that I went to Washington, D.C. to work on a federal government research program that then got spun off as the Bodie Technology Group.
And it's my understanding that Bodie Technology Group had some interaction or involvement with not only the September 11th issues, but also the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. Is that correct?
That's correct. It was my group at Bodie that was part of the group that excavated the crypt at Arlington National Cemetery and was able to identify the remains of Lieutenant Blassie in that crypt and return those remains to his family. And then because I had done a lot of work in New York previously with the head of the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner, when the towers went down, they called me and asked if we would do the bone fragments from Ground Zero. And so for about a year to 2 years after Ground Zero, one of our main projects in the laboratory was actually processing and identifying skeletal remains from 9/11.
Your Honor, this time, are you previously testified as it relates to DNA comparisons and or statistics in the state of Florida?
Yes, sir, I have many times.
And also throughout the United States?
Yes, throughout the United States as well as South America and Europe.
Your Honor, this time I attend to the witness.
Any more, Doctor?
No, Your Honor.
You may proceed.
Dr. McElfresh, you were contacted by the state and actually hired by the state to do an analysis that relates to the homicide investigation regarding Brandy Peters, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about samples that contain 2 donors versus more than 2 donors. As I understand it, first of all, let's talk about a buccal swab. What's a buccal swab?
That's the classical cheek swab. It's basically typically a wood Q-tip that you scrape inside the inside of your mouth. It scrapes off skin cells from the inside of your mouth. This is just called the buccal area, so it's called a buccal swab,
Okay.
mouth swab.
And as I understand it, from those buccal swabs, a electropherogram can be obtained.
Yes, there's typically a lot of DNA on those swabs. You can cut the swab, isolate DNA from that, and then run it through the standard lab procedures, and you get a result called an electropherogram.
Okay. And I'm showing some previously marked for or entries into evidence or states, defense exhibit 1A and B. This is an electropherogram that we're talking about?
Yes, that's an electropherogram. That's the raw data you get from isolating DNA. And quite nicely, the story of a case is written on that electropherogram. All of the DNA that you've gotten, the quality of that DNA, how many people are in the sample, all those things can be determined by looking at that electropherogram as you see it there.
Okay. And as I understand it, this is an electropherogram from Angel Avila that you had an opportunity to look at it throughout your analysis, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, as it relates to an electropherogram, this is a single donor situation, correct, as far as Mr. Avila's DNA goes, right?
That is correct, yes.
Which exhibit is this, Mr. Hughes?
This is Defense Exhibit 2A and B.
So page 1 is A and page 2 is B?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And we are looking at A right now, which is page 1. And I noticed throughout this electropherogram, it appears to either have 1 peak or 2 peaks. Is that correct?
That is correct, yes.
Is that typical in a situation with a buccal swab, a single donor?
Yes, that's exactly what you'd expect. You get half of your DNA from your mom and half from your dad, right? And sometimes you can get the exact same piece from mom and dad, in which case, like in that very first, I have a pointer here if you don't mind. Right here, that's where he got the same size DNA from mom and dad. So you get a single peak. Effectively, the DNA from mom and the DNA from dad is stacked on top of each other.
Okay.
Then when you get different pieces, you get the 2 peaks like this. And you'll notice these peaks are smaller in height, but that's because you have half the DNA in each of those peaks.
And then turning to 2B, we still see 2 peaks, correct?
That is correct, yes.
Okay. And let's talk about mixtures if we can.
All right.
As it relates to what is the signs of a 3-person or 3 or more person mixture?
Typically, because you can have 2 peaks per individual, if we have 2 people mixed together, we might expect 4 peaks in a particular area. And for 3, we might expect 6, and 4, we might expect 8. Okay? Now, as you saw, however, sometimes you get the same peak from mom and dad. So for a 3-person mixture, instead of having 6, you might have 5. You might even only have 4, depending on how common a particular DNA allele, which is one of the pieces of DNA, is actually found in the population. So you might expect, because these particular pieces of DNA are not distributed evenly through the population, that we will get some stacking as things get mixed. But usually, and typically, what you can do is look through the entire electropherogram and take the number of peaks and figure out how many donors there are in the sample.
Going back to 2A, I see that these are divided up into little sections there. Are those what we call loci?
Yes, each of these sections here, that's called a locus, and each of these peaks is called an allele. And it's just the way for us to keep track of things. And so as you see the numbers, and I can't quite make them out, but there we go. So for example, this is locus D21S11, and the alleles are 29 and 32.2, okay? And it's just a way for us to keep things straight and organized as we analyze the data. But the locus is the actual spot on chromosome 21 where that particular DNA is located. So D21S11 is an actual location on chromosome 21 in the human genome. And since we've sequenced all of the human genome now, we know precisely where these are and what to look for.
Okay. Next, if I can, I'm going to refer to you as this is defense 1A. Do you recognize this?
Yes, I do.
What is this?
This is an electropherogram of the mixture, and this would be from, looks like Exhibit 33.
Okay. And you were asked to look at this?
Yes.
And you were asked to look at this for the purposes of finding out inclusion or exclusion of that previous exhibit we just looked at with Angel Avila, correct?
That is correct.
In looking at this electropherogram, you previously talked about what you look for as it relates to whether there's a 2-person versus a 3-person or more donor situation. Do you see any signs in 1A that this is a mixture containing more than 2 donors?
No, this is clearly a mixture with 2 donors. And you can see, for example, here's a locus where you have 4 peaks. You have 2 very tall ones, 2 very short ones, okay? And then you have other places where you have just 2 peaks and maybe some indication down here on the baseline of something else. But this is a situation where you don't have a lot of DNA. As I said, the electropherogram is the story of the sample. Everything that's happened, the lab work, what kind of sample, All that information is contained on that electropherogram. And so you can look through this, but as you look, you see, as I said before, you can have situations where you have just 2 peaks, and you may have a minor in here, as this is indicated here. And because there's not a lot of DNA, there will be places where the second person isn't seen at all, where it's just simply not enough DNA to be seen. And all of that goes into your interpretation. But this is clearly an electropherogram of 2 individuals.
And let me clarify something. You were talking about the difference between a third person donor versus a 2-person donor, and you were mentioning that you could see 4 sometimes, but you're usually looking for 5 or more. Are you talking about at each loci, or are you talking about overall?
Overall, you're going to have a varying number of peaks at every locus, but at some peaks you'll have more than 4. You'll get a 5 or a 6 peak that's indicative of that third individual being in the sample. And we know from the actual population distribution of these alleles in the population that there are certain loci like D21S11. It has a very interesting fractured internal repeat molecular structure that causes it to be fairly well distributed in the population. So there's a locus where I expect to see, if I have 3 people in the mixture or 4, I expect to see a lot of peaks at that locus. There are several others like that. Loci with a simpler internal repeat structure like THO1 or TPOX, sometimes we get a lot of stacking in those loci, and I don't see a lot of difference. But that's, again, the story of the written on the electropherogram will give you that information.
I think you lost me a little bit when you were talking about the D21 and the S and something like that. What are you talking about? I'm sorry.
The actual DNA sequence within the locus itself that gives us the 8 and the 10 or the 32.2 that we looked at, the actual DNA sequence within the locus, they're repeated, right? So that's how we get these different numbers. So it would have 8 repeats of DNA, for example, or 10 repeats of DNA. They're little cassettes of DNA information that are repeated again and again. And so the way these repeats are set up will tell us how often we would expect to find that allele in a population, for example. And because we know those distributions and we're aware of this actual DNA sequence difference, we can begin to understand how many contributors are actually in that mixture and understand how these things might be stacked up.
Okay. So if I understand you correctly, and obviously correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm clearly a novice, especially compared to you, but as it relates to D21, I think you talked about the frequency in there, and if this was in fact a larger donor situation of more than 2 people, you would expect to see many more peaks.
I would, and in this particular case, you'll notice we just have 2 for a major contributor, and you can see that the minor contributor peaks are very low. And we know also that minor contributor is a male, right? This is the X and Y chromosome. We have a very tall X peak. We have a very small Y peak, which means that we expect the smaller peaks to be from a male, most likely, and that when we see small peaks together, they go together. So that is all part of the interpretation.
Okay. And again, in looking at Defense Exhibit 1A, you see no signs of, if I understand you correctly, you see no signs of a third donor. This is consistent with being a 2-person donor, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Next, let's look at 1B. Again, is there any signs of a third donor, or is this more consistent with a 2-donor situation?
This is consistent with a 2-donor situation. Again, the X and the Y chromosome, which are repeated. This is the kit called Cofiler. That's the brand name of it. And it contains some of the same peaks that we saw in the previous electropherogram. And you can see that here there's a hint of the minor contributor. Here, there's a minor contributor here. We know the contributor is male, the minor contributor is male, but there's clearly no indication of a third individual.
Okay. As it relates to that electropherogram in 1A and 1B, did you do a comparison as it relates to Mr. Avila's DNA, which is what we previously saw in Defense Exhibit 2A and 2B?
Yes, I did.
And did you make any kind of conclusions about whether or not Mr. Avila is the contributor for that second donor, the second minor donor?
I did. He's excluded as the minor donor. He has some similarities, but he doesn't have all of them. And where he does have similarities, they're in the wrong combination, so he's excluded.
Can you please explain that?
Well, for example, we know that the minor contributor is the short peak. So in this, for example, in this locus here, you have two tall peaks. That's the major contributor. The minor contributor is 1417, okay? That's the genotype of the individual who's the second minor contributor.
Maybe you could blow that up a little, Mr. Hughes, we can follow that.
And just for clarification, we're talking about the VWA loci, correct?
That's correct. That's the VWA locus. And you can see this is the minor contributor here, 1417. That's one individual. The second individual is this individual here, who's the 1518. And Mr. Avila at that locus is a 1718. So while those peaks are there, if we could go back to that previous, you can see the problem is the 17 and the 18 belong to two different individuals. So this individual has to be a 1417 and he's a 1718, so he's actually excluded there because he doesn't have the 14, right? That person has to have the 14. And there are a number of other places where the peak just isn't there at all.
Okay.
So he's excluded.
As it relates to this one spot, let's just say at VWA, the fact that he doesn't match up in that one loci, does that exclude him in its entirety from the entire?
Yes, it does. And what we know is, given how these alleles are distributed in populations, once you see the exclusion once, you expect to see it 2, 3, or 4 times, and you do. You see it in a number of different places throughout the electropherogram.
Where else do we see an exclusion?
Exclusions we see at D18, S51. We see it at D5, S818. We see an exclusion at D7. A similar exclusion to this, I believe, at CSF. So there's a number of different places where he's just not there. And you can see at D18, for example, let me find my note here so I keep them straight. At D18, you can see we have a 17, 18, and 19. There's a very small 18, but there's no 15 at all. There's nothing there. 15 is down in this area here. And the minor has to be, if it's going to be Mr. Avila, has to be 15, 18. You see, we see something at 18 that got called at this is a value here that's pretty small, relatively speaking, and that's just gone. And that's consistent, again, with the overall story that we see from the electropherogram. It isn't like we're taking that out of context and looking at only that, but as you look at the entire electropherogram, that fits with the entire story of the result.
No further questions.
Mr. McElfresh, I want to ask you a couple general questions first before I ask you about your analysis of the electropherogram in this case. Do you agree that there is some space between, and I keep trying to figure out the best way to say this, but FDLE has guidelines, or SWGDAM has guidelines for interpretation of DNA, correct?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. And there are guidelines for calling something a clean two-person mixture, right?
Generally, yes.
Okay. And then there are guidelines above that about calling something a three-person mixture, correct?
Yes, they're typically referred to as complex mixtures, yes.
Okay.
Complex what?
Mixtures.
Do you agree in the general sense that there is some space between what qualifies as a two-person mixture and what qualifies as a three-person mixture where it can be at least two persons with indication of possible contribution by a third?
The fact of the matter is the data are pretty clear. What we don't actually have is a precise test. I don't have some specific test that I can do. I can't dip a stick into the DNA, if you will, and get an answer that says 2 and only 2, 3 and only 3. What we have to do is the genetics, and that's very important here, is knowing the genetics of these systems. So there is oftentimes language that say at least 2, right, which means 2. But because we don't have a precise test for that, the language can be imprecise.
And so one of the things that a DNA analyst might generally do to try to determine if they're going to interpret a sample, how many people are in it, is make logical assumptions based on the type of object it is, where it's found, and who would have access to it. Is that a fair statement?
Generally, yes, but more importantly are the actual results of the electropherogram. That will tell you an awful lot about the overall quality of the DNA, and it is the quality of the DNA that will be the deciding factor.
Well, the electropherogram can be subject to some inaccuracies sometimes, right? Let's talk about stutter, for example. When stutter happens, can stutter push, let's say, 30 RFUs, which doesn't even qualify as a start allele, right?
That's correct. You can get stutter, you get artifacts in electropherogram, and you look for those. You know what those kinds of artifacts are, and you interpret appropriately.
And so let's say you have a little bit of DNA from some third donor, 30, 40, 50 RFUs. If it's in stutter position to the major contributor to a mixture, can it push that little bit of DNA from a third party that's there up into a callable limit?
Typically, no. The problem you have here is that if you have a third person in a mixture and they happen to have a peak that would fit in a stutter position at one locus, they're going to have a peak that doesn't fit in a stutter position at another locus, unless you're trying to require that they somehow have a DNA type that is one off from every peak that you see. And we know from the population distribution of these alleles in the population that's just highly unlikely.
Maybe I asked the question too specifically. What I really want to know, and really want to see if you agree in the general sense, DNA can stack on top of stutter to create what looks like a callable allele when it wouldn't otherwise be above the callable limit, correct?
It's possible, but if that were the case, typically you see differences in the electropherogram that allows you to sort that out.
Okay, and that's something that you mentioned sorting out. That's something subject to not only the interpretive guidelines, but analyst discretion, correct?
It requires a trained analyst to do it, absolutely.
Right. Okay. With respect to the sample that you were talking about with Mr. Fuchs, it's true that you see dropout throughout, correct? Alleles falling off the electropherogram, not reading. Is that right?
That's correct. As I pointed out, there were missing alleles.
Okay. And it's your belief that based on a number of factors, Mr. Fuchs used the 14 present at VWA as an example, that Mr. Avila would be excluded from contributing to this mixture, correct?
That's correct.
And that conclusion rests on the fact that it's, to you, a clean two-person mixture, correct?
That is correct.
If it were not a clean two-person mixture, he wouldn't be able to be excluded.
If it weren't a clean mixture, it would be more difficult to exclude him. However, there are certain places in the electropherogram where he's missing and there are peaks there. So he would be excluded in that situation no matter how many people were contributing. So it is not easy to do these interpretations, but it is certainly possible and doable.
You mentioned that you reviewed Joel and Brown's findings, is that right?
I did.
Relative to this sample?
Yes.
Did you also review Jason Bundy's findings relative to this sample?
I looked at a number of different versions of this sample and this electropherogram in particular.
Is that a yes? I just want to make sure.
Well, I'm not sure to which you're referring, but specifically this electropherogram from this sample.
The one that Mr. Fuchs had on the board?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you review Mr. Bundy's interpretive notes about that electropherogram, informing your opinion?
What I did when I looked at this sample was to look at the electropherogram on my own without looking at anybody else's notes and decide whether I agreed with what I saw in the electropherogram or not. I've been doing this for 30 years now. And it has always been that what you do is look at the electropherogram first. And even if I have some indication of notes from another individual on the electropherogram, I form my own opinion, and then there have been cases in my life where I've disagreed with previous individuals, and that's part of the science.
Okay, so you recognize there's disagreement. Do you also recognize that in this case, of the 4 analysts who looked at this electropherogram, you're the only one who calls it a clean 2-person mixture?
Okay, it's still a clean 2-person mixture
To you?
to me.
Okay. Isn't it true, Mr. McElfresh, that the death penalty conviction in a case involving a death of a child was just vacated earlier this year because counsel during the trial...
Let's go sidebar, please.
Yes, sir.
There's a follow-up question from the jury, and Dr. McElfresh, if you didn't look at this, just tell us that. But the question is, could DNA from the 3-year-old boy be excluded from this mixture? Javante Segura was one of the victims in the case of 3-year-old boy.
I'm afraid I didn't have that information to look at.
Okay. All right. Anything further, Mr. Pugh?
That's what I'm saying.
Prince. All right, you can step down. Go your next witness.
All right, this time stay included for both.
All right. Let's let the jury step out. Let me meet with the lawyers just a little bit and come up with I think we have a schedule, but let me discuss it with them one more time. Everybody can be seated. Well, we're a little earlier than I anticipated, but I assume y'all still desire to break till tomorrow and do closing and instructions tomorrow.
Much I'd like to get it done with the issue of sequestration, I think that's a good idea being the first day of school, so we'll try and do it tomorrow.
Mr. Prince?
Yes, sir, I prefer to do it tomorrow.
Okay. And so we will instruct and close in the morning, send them out to deliberate. If we get a first-degree murder conviction, we're going to do that Thursday and Friday. That's everybody's understanding.
Yes.
We're going to need to have a time when we work on jury instructions on that. There's certainly a lot more in question than the jury instructions on the first part of this, so we may need to spend some time on that. You'll want to try to do that tomorrow afternoon while the jury's deliberating.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Any special instructions anybody wants me to give to the jury?
Yeah. None from the defense.
You want me to bring them into the courtroom to excuse them? Or, I probably should. That's right. Bring them in. Let's go. Right. What's that? Bringing the change of clothes. Okay. All right, everybody be seated. Well, it went a little quicker this morning than had been projected, but I guess we can't complain about that. I still think even at this, we've eaten up too much of the day to try to do it all today. So at this point, we're going to break. One should be back tomorrow at 8:30. We're going to do instructions and close an argument. That'll probably take us up to about lunchtime, and then you will begin deliberating. We'll arrange to have lunch brought in for you so you won't have to be going out at lunchtime. Hopefully we get it resolved tomorrow, but if not, I've already warned you, once you start deliberating, I can't send you home until we have a verdict. So bring an overnight bag tomorrow, just in case we have to sequester you for tomorrow. Again, don't talk to anybody about the case or let anybody talk to you about it, read any media accounts or do any independent research. So anybody have any questions about what's expected of them or whatever? All right. Like I said yesterday, it would take us about 3 hours. You mix in a lunch break, we'd be sending it to you about 4 o'clock or so. I just think that's too late to start with your deliberation. I know probably some of you would prefer to get it done today, but we've invested a lot of time and energy in it. We want to do it right. So anyway, we'll see y'all tomorrow morning at 8:30. Thank you. Hang on, be seated. I know when we talk about jury instructions a minute, when we discussed them before, the state asked me to put actually possessed into the discharge with great bodily harm and discharge, and originally I did so. That was before I had a chance to go back and read the statute and read the standard jury instruction. That is not the language in the statute or in the standard jury instruction, so I've taken that language back out. So essentially it's what I started with. It is a matter of statutory interpretation. I'm not free to change what the legislature wrote. The 3 categories under 775-087 are actual possession, discharge, and discharge with great bodily harm or death. So that's, unless somebody has some case showing me that there's a problem with that, that's the language we're going to go with. Somebody have a case that says there's a problem with that?
I did not pull a case, Your Honor.
Well, I don't think there is one, because that's what the statute says, and the statute's been repeatedly upheld. But anyway, if you've got a case that says that there's an error in the standard jury instructions, or that somehow they've added to the statute, I'll be glad to hear it. I'll need it this afternoon. I don't think any exists, and the rules as I understand them is I'm to use the standard jury instructions unless there's a reason not to, and I've found no reason not to use the standard instruction. Y'all found anything else on the jury instructions?
No, sir.
Okay. Have y'all looked at them again?
Not since your JA sent them out this morning, I have not.
Right. I sent, so you've gotten it twice. So first I sent out what we'd agreed on in court on Friday, and then I went back after having a chance to research it this morning, and I made a few, they're just, I wouldn't say there were typos, there's semantics. I changed a couple of things to try to more carefully do what the state had asked to differentiate the counts. And the only thing of substance is I deleted the language about actual possession in those other 2 enhancements. If there's any chance there's an issue, we need to set a time this afternoon to come back and discuss it. I don't want to find out tomorrow morning at 8:30 somebody has an objection, because I want to go straight into instructions in the morning.
Judge, I'll read them by 1 o'clock. I'll send you an email if there's a problem. If you don't hear from me, there's no problem.
I want to have a a little more defined, a little more definite than that, because I don't want to show up at 8:30 and somebody finds a mistake, or some,
An email that there's no problem.
all right. Mr. Evans?
That will be accepted, Your Honor.
Okay.
I don't anticipate it from the clerk's side.
Right. And so if anybody wants to be heard, let's just plan, you'll send an email to my office and we'll reconvene at 1:30 if either side wants to be heard. So send my JA an email confirming one way or the other, please. So, and if there's an issue, we'll meet at 1:30. I just want to be able to walk in at 8:30, hand the instructions to the jury, instruct them, and be straight into closing. So I don't want some legal issue coming up. Does anybody foresee any other legal issue we need to resolve before we get into instructions and closing?
No.
All right. Well, let me just in the case of abundance of caution, I should say, anybody who has an issue they want to raise before instruction or closing, let me know so that we can reconvene at 1:30 and we will do it. Because I want to, like I say, I want to walk in the morning, start instructing the jury. So if there's some issue, think about it, let me know. All right?
Thank you, John.
Thank you. We'll be in recess. Yeah. You're asking me to gaze into the crystal ball and see what these creative attorneys come up with. Probably not. Why, you trying to?
Well, no, I'm not the agent.
Yeah.
I could just tell Kathy.
Yeah, why don't you just tell Kathy? I mean, I think it's 99% no. Yeah.
But I will tell her the answer.
Okay, all right. So if something comes up, we'll notify Kathy.
Yes.
Okay. Beth will let you know if something comes up.